His body stank of death long before it claimed him. Rotting flesh, leaking pus, and the fetid stench of gangrene marked the slow, horrifying descent of King Henry VIII. By the end, his leg was a cavern of infection, oozing with decay, swaddled in silks that could not mask the odor. Servants gagged. Physicians recoiled. The once mighty Lion of England lay ensnared in a body betraying him in every foul way imaginable. And yet, he clung to power, while his very skin dissolved. This was no noble death. This was a nightmare written in boils and blood. What happened to the king who once danced with queens and broke with Rome? How did a sovereign become a spectacle of rotting horror? The answer begins years earlier, with a fall, a single ride, a flash of hooves, and a moment that cracked not just bone, but everything Henry would become. It was January 1536, a joust, a crowd, the king, resplendent in armor, hungry for glory. But glory turned to horror in an instant. His horse reared. Henry fell. The full weight of 275 pounds crashed to the earth. His armored body slammed against the ground, and then silence. For 2 hours, he lay unconscious, limbs twisted, eyes shut. Courtiers feared the worst. Whispers flew through the halls. The king is dead. But Henry woke, and something inside him had changed. The leg, yes, the leg was shattered. It would never heal right. From that moment forward, an infection burrowed into his flesh, never fully leaving, always oozing back to the surface. One wound that would fester for a decade and a half, unraveling his mind, poisoning his soul. That fall wasn't just an accident. It was the beginning of his end. The spark that started the slow burn of royal decay inside and out. From that day on, he became a man haunted by pain. The wound turned septic, reeking through palaces. Thick, yellow discharge soaked his bandages. At times, the leg would burst open without warning. Surgeons cut it, drained it, burned it. Nothing stopped the rot, and the pain twisted him. No longer the golden boy of Tudor courts, Henry grew monstrous. His moods darkened, as if the leg were whispering madness into his ear. Fury erupted in waves, courtiers executed, wives discarded. Catherine Howard, barely past girlhood, paid with her head. Would he have spared her, had he been whole, or had the abscess drained his mercy dry? The king bled inward too. Love, joy, reason, all infected. He blamed the world, God, his wives. But he never blamed the horse, never the fall. In public, he limped with forced dignity. In private, he screamed. Even his bed linens could not conceal the blackened ulcers that festered beneath royal flesh. He consumed meat and mead like a man trying to forget he was dying. Mountains of food vanished down a mouth twisted with rot and fat. His once athletic frame dissolved into bloat, his waist reportedly ballooning past 54 inches. And the leg kept suppurating, reinfecting, pulsing with pus. His physicians, fearing anger more than God, dared not tell him the truth. They disguised their horror as procedure, wrapping the decaying limb in bandages that grew heavier with each passing week. The court learned to live with the stench. They no longer flinched. They adapted. Decay became the rhythm of life within the palace walls. And yet behind the crown, behind the thrones and laws and inheritances, a man was slowly decomposing while still alive. Did he know? Did Henry VIII recognize the irony that the empire he ruled without mercy was cleaner, more orderly, more intact than the body that ruled it? If he did, he never said. The rot spoke louder than words. As the ulcers deepened and the smell intensified, death lingered in every room he entered. Even his closest aides avoided eye contact, gagging as they leaned in to change his dressings. The palace air grew thick with perfume in a futile attempt to mask the putrefaction that now defined their sovereign. By 1546, Henry VIII was more corpse than king, a swollen parody of power perched atop a throne of infection. His body barely moved without help. Lifting his massive frame had become a grim ritual for the servants who dreaded each morning. Whispers of gangrene and unholy punishment spread among them. Did they believe his body rotted from divine judgment? That the endless executions, the shattered marriages, the dissolution of monasteries had come back not as ghosts but as wounds. By the time he signed his final will, his hand trembled, fingers distorted, skin peeling. He ruled to the end, but his final conquest was his own destruction. And then came the final night, January 27th, 1547. The great king, once feared, once adored, lay alone in a bed soaked with his own fluids. No physician dared to pronounce him dying, not allowed. For in Tudor law, speaking of the monarch's death before it occurred was treason. So they watched in silence, as his breathing slowed, as his limbs stiffened, as his skin gave way to the blackened signature of death. Some said he screamed in those last hours. Others claimed he fell into a murmuring stupor, whispering to ghosts only he could see. Anne Boleyn, Wolsey, Cromwell, Jane. The air was electric with unspoken guilt, and when his heart stopped, it stopped in a body already half decayed. King Henry VIII did not slip gently into the grave. He was dragged toward it by the very sins he had carved into flesh and history. A living corpse, finally surrendered to the worms that had long since claimed his soul. But even in death, Henry's nightmare was not over. His bloated corpse, sealed in a lead-lined coffin, was to be transported to Windsor. Along the way, the unthinkable happened. The coffin leaked. Putrid fluids pooled beneath it as it sat overnight in Sion Abbey. Legend holds that dogs broke into the chapel, lapping at the ichor that seeped from the king's remains. Some called it poetic justice. Others wept in silence, half out of fear, half out of knowing. This was no peaceful passing. This was divine reckoning, spelled in blood, bile, and horror. The body of England's most infamous monarch had become a warning, an unburied prophecy rotting in real time. His tomb would be shared with Jane Seymour, the only wife he truly loved, yet the grave held no comfort. For power fades, flesh fails, and even kings, once wrapped in silks and ceremony, will spill open one day to meet the worms they feared. Yet the death of Henry VIII was not the end of his corruption. His legacy, like his body, festered across generations. The Anglican Church, born from his lust and fury, would ignite centuries of division and war. His children inherited more than a throne. They inherited shadows, suspicion, blood-stained blueprints for power. Elizabeth the Virgin Queen watched her mother lose her head and her father rot from within. Edward ruled briefly, ghost-like. Mary burned heretics in a desperate grasp for redemption. All bore scars left by the king whose leg never healed. Even today, the mythology of Henry survives, whitewashed in portraits and drama. But strip away the jewels, the songs, the legends, and you're left with a man who died as he lived, bloated by excess, crippled by pain, feared, and never truly mourned. His final truth lies not in the history books, but in the rot that once poured from his body. A royal life undone, drop by drop, by its own infection. And still, somewhere beneath the crumbling marble of Windsor, the king remains, or what's left of him. Bones now, blackened and brittle, housed in a tomb meant to magnify majesty, but haunted instead by what majesty could not defend against: time, decay, and truth. Tourists pass by unknowing, snapping photos of a monarch reduced to myth. But if they listened closely, if silence filled the stone chamber long enough, perhaps they'd hear it: the whisper of pain, the gurgle of rot, the echo of a throne that devoured its own. Henry VIII ruled like a god, but died like a warning. His death was not just the end of a man. It was a mirror held to power itself, a reflection of what happens when might goes unchecked and flesh is treated like destiny. The ulcers were not the sickness. They were the symptom. The true disease? Hubris, and no bandage in history could ever stop its spread. Even now, 5 centuries later, his story seeps through cracks in history like the fluid from his festering wound. King Henry VIII remains a cautionary tale, not of power won, but of life lost slowly, grotesquely, piece by rotting piece. His legacy marches on in stained-glass windows and classroom syllabi, but the stench, the sickness, the sorrow of his final years rarely make it in. We sanitize his story. We forget the screams, the ulcers, the swollen corpse that burst its bindings, because it's easier that way, easier to crown him in golden memories than to face the flesh that failed him. But history does not forget what we choose to erase, and in the dark corners of his tomb, Beneath centuries of stone and silence, the truth lingers still, clinging like mold to memory, reminding us that even the grandest empires rot from the inside when they worship power over humanity. So the next time you see his portrait broad-shouldered, expression stern, hands resting on gilded belt, remember what the oil and pigment left out. Behind that painted gaze was a man whose leg rotted for years as the crown sat heavy upon a decaying skull. Beneath the brocade was a wound that would never close, and behind the throne, a silence that grew louder with every execution, every betrayal, every drop of blackened blood. His was not merely a death of flesh, but a slow cancellation of the self. The mirror he left behind shows us more than Tudor splendor. It reflects the price of unchecked power, the decay of conscience dressed in royal cloth. His story is not finished. It festers in every corridor where ambition outruns compassion, where sovereignty silences suffering. Henry VIII was not just a king, he was a warning in human form, and warnings, unlike kings, never die, they echo. But his echo is not confined to history books or dusty monuments. It seeps into modern corridors of power, into every leader who mistakes cruelty for strength, every ruler who cloaks rot in ritual. Henry VIII became legend, not through greatness, but through grotesque unraveling. His body disintegrated as his kingdom watched powerless to challenge the divine facade. And in that silence dwells the terrible lesson that a man can rule, destroy, and decay all at once and still be remembered with reverence. But behind every statue, every epic, there is flesh that failed, love that curdled, and justice that never came. The great King Henry did not ride nobly into legacy. He was dragged, piece by piece, down a hallway of horror of his own making. And as long as power exists unchecked, as long as ambition tramples empathy, the rot will return. Not always in flesh, sometimes in law, in silence, in history's reluctant, festering remembrance. This is the truth we rarely tell about kings, not the coronations, or the pageants, or the victories carved in stone, but the rot, the ruin, the agony too human to enshrine. Henry VIII died not only in body, but in myth, decomposing from man to monster and back again. He reminds us that power is not armor. It does not shield against infection, nor sorrow, nor mortality. He reminds us that even the mightiest figure can fall not by sword or uprising, but by their own corrupted flesh, that even a king can die screaming, soaked in his own decay, forgotten for the suffering he caused, remembered for the spectacle he became. And as we close his story, as the whisper fades through time's long corridor, one truth remains unburied. Nothing rots faster than a crown worn without wisdom, and no torment festers deeper than the one we carve into our own flesh, drop by infected drop. So we remember him not for his greatness, but for his grotesqueness, for the raw, unflinching testament of what unchecked power, unhealed pain, and unexamined brutality can become. Henry VIII was a man whose body rotted as his nation watched in reverent silence, a man who broke from the Pope only to become a pope of his own torment, a man who severed ties with the past while trapping himself in a present of festering misery. In every ulcer, a prayer unanswered. In every scream, a soul unraveling. His death was not tragic because it was painful. It was tragic because it was earned. A burial could not purify what living so deeply stained. And so his final legacy lies not in the tower he built, nor the church he forged, but in the lesson carved into every scabbed inch of flesh he left behind. Power does not rot cleanly. It clings, corrodes, and consumes, until all that remains is the stench of what might have been. And thus, Henry VIII remains not merely a figure of fascination, but a grotesque parable stitched into the flesh of history. His reign is remembered in dates and decrees, but his death, his true legacy, lives in the silent dread of unchecked dominion. He was a monarch who remade his nation, only to let his own body become a living ruin. Every ulcer whispered of vengeance, every foul breath a sermon on the hubris of kings. We wrap tyranny in myth to make it palatable, but peel back the pageantry, and the truth is raw, reeking, and blood-wet. This is the lesson beneath the Tudor rose, that real horror wears a crown and walks on a rotting leg. We cannot exhume Henry without unearthing ourselves what we forgive in leaders, what we worship in strength, what we ignore when power festers. His end was not just a moment, it was a mirror, and it's still reflecting. And so, the tale decays to its final breath. King Henry VIII, once lion, once son, once sovereign without rival, left behind more than a corpse. He left a caution, a rotting relic of what becomes of those who place power above flesh, ego above empathy, and tyranny above truth. No balm could cure arrogance. No surgeon could heal a soul severed by its own cruelty. In the end, it wasn't an assassin or an army that brought him down. It was what he never feared: time, pain, and the slow mutiny of his own skin. His body was both battlefield and betrayer, and his legacy is not gold nor glory, but the stench of unchecked zeal staining every inch of power he touched. Let this not be a history lesson, let it be a warning. For long after crowns fade and monuments crumble, what remains is the rot we refuse to see, festering in silence, patient and eternal. For in the end, all that remains is the echo of footsteps through palace halls heavy with secrets, the echo of whispered prayers from wives now headless and saints now silenced, the echo of a ruler whose flesh could no longer contain his sins. Henry VIII became immortal, not through love or law, but through the gruesome truth he could never escape, a truth not chiseled into granite, but liquefied through his veins, pouring from an endless wound the crown could not hide. His story ends not with a triumph or a final word, but with a silence so loud it stains the centuries. And somewhere, beneath Windsor's polished stone, that silence still breathes, not with grace, not with peace, but with the rank breath of history's darkest caution, a reminder that what we crown in glory may end in rot, and what decays in secret always finds its way back into the light. And now, centuries later, the rot remains not in flesh, but in memory. We walk through museums, glance at portraits, recite names like Henry VIII with rehearsed awe, but few see the truth behind the oil and canvas. Few remember the man who died drowning in his own fluids, whose legacy oozes with anguish, not honor. We inherit his story sanitized, stripped of stench, softened by time. Yet beneath every legend lies the unspoken decay we choose not to confront. It waits in vaults of silence, in footnotes and forgotten crypts, whispering that power built on suffering, dominance forged in pain, will always collapse inward. This is Henry's true monument, not marble, not stained glass, but the haunting realization that greatness without conscience rots from the inside. And as long as we pretend otherwise, the echo of his agony lives on, reminding us that history does not forget, it ferments, softly, slowly, until it demands to be unearthed once more. This is not just the tale of a dying king, it is the anatomy of decay itself, intimate, visceral, and horrifyingly human. We look back at Henry VIII and see a monarch larger than life, but beneath the crown beat a heart stifled by cruelty, a body surrendering to its own vengeance. In the end, he wasn't devoured by enemies, but by the rot he'd sown in himself and his reign. His death was earned, not as punishment, but as prophecy. We remember his power, but must not forget its price. The pain, the putrefaction, the peril of becoming untouchable, because when leaders believe they're gods, their flesh becomes the first to rebel. And like Henry, they fall piece by rotting piece, not in the blaze of glory, but in the silence of collapse. So let his story stand, unvarnished and unburied, a truth too foul to prettify, too loud to silence, a crown lost to the flesh it crowned. Because in the end, Henry VIII was not defeated by armies, nor betrayed by counsel, but consumed by the very empire he built upon his own flesh. His royal body became his reckoning, a slow, festering tribute to every soul he crushed, every vow he broke, every moment humanity gave way to hunger. There were no banners raised at his death, only the shudder of civilization watching its sovereign rot alive. We tell his story not for morbid fascination, but because truth, like infection, spreads, and this truth seeps through centuries to urge us. Beware the king too mighty to bleed, for he will, in silence, in shadow, until his fall becomes a fever that history cannot forget. So let us close this chapter not with reverence, but with remembrance that no throne, no title, no divine claim can armor the soul when it turns against itself. And Henry's soul, long before his body, was the first to decay. Let this be the final wound laid bare, not Henry's, but ours, the collective gash in memory that festers when we mistake majesty for morality. His story is not ancient, it is immediate. Every time we flinch from truth, falter in justice, or spin cruelty into leadership, the rot returns. Henry VIII is gone, but the echo of his decay hums beneath every gilded facade we still revere. What is left of him is not just bone but warning, not just a king but a caution carved in flesh and failure. We end not with myth, but with marrow, not with legend, but with loss. A body bloated by its own dominion, a soul starved of grace. This was his death. This is his echo. And if we listen not with ears, but with conscience, we may hear what the silks and ceremonies tried to hide, that history's most grotesque death is not in what was suffered, but in what was allowed to fester. So we bury him again, this time not beneath stone, but beneath truth, not as a king, but as a lesson. Henry VIII's final gift was not the Church of England, nor the heirs he left behind, but a story that peels away the illusion of invincibility. He reminds us that no crown can prevent collapse, no decree can cure decay, and no legacy is immune to the rot of its origin. His body is gone, but his fall remains. It remains in corridors of power, in institutions built on silence, in every place where brutality is cloaked in ceremony. His grotesque end is not an anomaly, it is a revelation, a grotesque anatomy of ambition left unchecked. And so, centuries from now, as his name is whispered through chambered tours and glossed over texts, may we remember not just his reign, but the ruin, not just the monarch, but the man eaten by the very thing he thought made him immortal, his power. In the end, we do not revisit Henry VIII to gawk at gore, but to confront the quiet rot that thrives beneath power unpunished. His life was a theatre of splendor, his death a dirge of decay, and within that grotesque transition lies history's reflection. We see in him the cost of unchecked will, of indulgence mistaken for strength, of cruelty crowned as command. His wound was never just physical, it was national, spiritual, moral, festering unnoticed, until it could not be ignored. So let this be the closing whisper woven through centuries of silence. His agony was not unique, his fall was not distant, because whenever we bow to grandeur without asking what it hides, whenever we crown authority without question, the rot returns. Henry VIII is buried, but what he became, what he decayed into, still walks beside us, not in royal robes, but in the lingering stench of forgotten consequence. And history, ever patient, never forgets the smell of a truth buried too long. So ends the saga of Henry VIII, not with a flourish of trumpets, but with the slow, suffocating silence of flesh betraying power. He was not just a ruler, but a relic of what happens when might eclipses mercy. His throne still stands in memory, but beneath its velvet lies a truth too heavy to crown, a truth that seeps through generations like the rancid pus that once soaked his silks. We do not remember him because he was regal, we remember him because he was rot, made royal. And in every story told, in every portrait hung, in every lesson half taught, we must ask, do we honor the king, or enshrine the decay that consumed him? Because history did not punish Henry, his own body did. And perhaps that is the cruelest judgment of all, that no executioner could wound him as deeply as the sins he let fester just beneath his own skin. The king is dead, his warning lives on. And so, as the veil of centuries settles over his grave, let us not remember Henry VIII as a titan cast in marble or myth, but as a man undone by his own unrelenting hunger. His story is not a relic of the past, but a living illustration of truth warped by power, of flesh desecrated by ego. Beneath the gold, beneath the grandeur, was always the rot patient, festering, inevitable. We can dress it in robes and call it sovereignty, but in the end, it seeps through, because history is not kind to forgetfulness, and time does not sanitize what was suffered. Henry's corpse has long since returned to dust, but his decay persists in systems, in silence, in the places we refuse to look. Let this be our reckoning, not his. For the lesson he left, unspoken yet undeniable, is this: what we refuse to heal will one day consume us. And in that final mirror, We are all kings at rot's door. So we leave him there, entombed not just in stone, but in the lingering stench of forgotten truths. Henry VIII, a monarch swallowed by his appetites, a sovereign whose kingdom endured longer than his own flesh could bear. His legacy is not etched solely in acts and edicts, but in the slow, grotesque unraveling of a body that mirrored its ruler's soul. Let it be known, kings, like all men, rot, not always in death, but in life, in conscience, in unchecked cruelty, cloaked in grandeur. And in Henry's final, gasping silence beneath Windsor's cold floor, history speaks not of glory, but of decay fulfilled. A caution, carved in corruption, a memory, steeped in warning, and a truth as enduring as time itself, that in the end, the flesh tells all. The crown may shine, the throne may rise, but it is the wound that remembers, and beneath every empire's splendor lies the pulse of its inevitable rot. So let the final word not be his name, but the silence it left behind. Among incense and iron, silk and screams, Henry VIII reminds us that decay does not begin in the flesh, it begins in the choices we fail to question. His story is not finished because we are still living its lesson. In palaces and policies, in governments and grudges, the echo of his rot curls through time, asking who we become when power is not earned but taken, not tempered, but indulged. We close this dirge not with grandeur, but with gravity. For though Henry's body lies still, the warning it left pulses louder with every forgotten consequence. This was the death of a king, but more so, the autopsy of unaccountable power. And as we step away from his tomb, the scent follows. Rot, after all, does not die. It waits. And if history has taught us anything at all, it's this: it always returns.